I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Management Institute, and I want to begin by noting in this moment when many of us are working in different places and meeting remotely that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are gathered and the land on which our remote participants are currently working. And we recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. Our speaker today is Sarah Willen. Sarah is professor of anthropology at UConn and director of the research program on global health and human rights at the university's Human Rights Institute, or sister institute, as I like to think. She is a critical medical anthropologist with a strong phenomenological bent, and she has published widely on topics ranging from the socio-political dynamics of lived experiences of legalized migration and human rights activism to everyday understandings of deservingness, dignity, and flourishing in Israel, Palestine, and in the US. She is author or editor of 4 books, 5 special issues, many articles and book chapters, and of course the multiple award-winning monograph, Fighting for Dignity, Migrant Lives, and Israel's Margins. She is also the director and co-founder of the Pandemic Journaling Project, the focus of her talk tonight. And commenting on leading the discussion in the Q&A period is Eric Freeman, our Draper Dissertation Fellow. Eric is, as I just said, the Draper Dissertation Fellow at UConn at the Institute and a doctoral candidate in UConn's Department of History. And he's been, we've had a chance to hear from him already, so, and he's learned about this exciting project. And also, I want to mention his recent article on true Christianity, the flowering and fading of Mormonism, and romantic socialism in 19th century France, which really brings together the 2 themes that he's been navigating here at the Institute. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Sarah Willen.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you also to those who are Zooming in. I am hopeful that some of our Pandemic Journaling Project team members are with us, and maybe even some of the folks who've been journaling with the project and some of our community partners. So that's really the broad audience that I have in mind today. And as you can see, if I can get myself squared away here, what I'd like to talk about today is a project that has invited people around the world to take a little bit of time each week to reflect on how COVID-19 has affected them. And as you can see from my title, it's now become quite a large archive. So let's get right started. Really, one of the things that we wanted to do in creating this project, and I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk through the mechanics and tell you who's participating and what people are contributing, is really this message here on the screen. And this is from a journaler, a woman who joined the project pretty early on. She's in her 60s, she lives in the Midwest. And she really kind of boiled it all down into a statement that I think sums up what it is we're trying to do. Writing relatively early in the pandemic, she said, the pandemic has attacked us right where we are most human. It's tried to rob us of our connectedness. And so as you'll see, this kind of wild and crazy project that we put together is really trying to speak to that gap, that vacuum, that need, and also provide ways for people to be creative in trying to process what they're living through. So I want to make sure from the very beginning, I acknowledge my co-founder, Kate Mason at Brown University. This is very much a collaborative project. I'll flash pictures of some of our other team members on the screen, but I need to really acknowledge that I'm standing on many shoulders of many wonderful and brilliant people. So if you go to the homepage for the Pandemic Journaling Project, this is what you see. Really, what we're trying to do is recognize the fact that history is usually written by the powerful. And we start with this commitment that, this is an effort to make sure that's not what happens. And of course, in the past nearly 2 years, we've seen many projects emerge that are trying to speak to this need. We're kind of proud of the fact that we got rolling in May 2020. And I have to acknowledge the Humanities Institute as really the first of what eventually became many supporters of this project. So this is sort of our call. We have a really wonderful 1-minute introductory video that some of our students put together that you can watch online if you'd like. The entire project runs simultaneously in English and in Spanish. That's been really important from the beginning. And so what I'd like to do is sort of take a couple of minutes to tell you, what is this project? Who are the people who started using it, participating in it, joining it? What are they actually doing when they're journaling? Why would people participate in something like this? And then what can we learn from EJP, from this project, about the pandemic and also about ourselves? And as you see, I'm really going to be taking this time to think in a new direction. So I'll allude a little bit to some of the work that we've been doing. Kate and I are both medical anthropologists. So we think as social scientists, we think about health, we think about, policy and clinical implications. That's not what I'm going to talk about for the most part today. I'm going to move in another direction that really has grown out of my time here at the Humanities Institute. In particular, some conversations that Alexis and I have been having about a portion of this material that I haven't really looked at, that we haven't really looked at carefully yet. And that's the visual materials that people have contributed. But first, I want to give you a little bit.
Almost a year in.
So what I'm going to share is a 2-minute sound collage that was produced by Laurel Paymuller in Global Affairs for us here at UConn. And it's an audio window onto what some people have been experiencing this time. So just give it 2 minutes and let it kind of wash over you. So let's try that from the top.
Almost a year in, and I guess I just found this project.
It's been a really tough year.
This week has been a rough one.
COVID affects my life in many ways.
It's hard to even remember what things were like before.
Que hay que aprovechar el tiempo, hay que aprovechar a las personas, hay que aprovechar.
Restrictions are being lifted slightly, even though
Everything has
cases are going
been
up. But
so
I think it
much
was
the
yesterday,
same
we
for
didn't
so
have any
many
deaths,
weeks
so
now.
to go to work, stress out, and then carrying that stress
There's been
home
a lot
and
of
trying
moments
to
when you're alone with your thoughts.
That sometimes it feels like it's all going to fall apart at any
This is my
minute.
reality. This is my first year
I
of
miss
college.
being
I have
around
nothing
people. I
else
miss
to
going to
compare it
concerts.
to.
I miss going to the bar. I miss
So
hanging
this
out
is
with
my
all
normal.
my friends and
And
some of my
honestly,
family.
I'm
sneeze
grateful
or
to have
I
not
cough,
know
everybody
everything
thinks I have
yourself
corona.
like to not
with something else,
be aware of
to not be thinking about like
what
the
I don't
regrets that you
have.
have and the
And
mistakes
maybe
you
I
made
should
and-
not, I
to work
shouldn't,
from
I don't want to be a
Pandemic
burden
has shown me that
always sharing this.
It just doesn't feel real sometimes.
sustainable in the long term.
Although things are looking up, the vaccines
Far
are
away off.
coming.
We're getting there. I'm getting
it's still
vaccinated
Daily
next weekend,
mindfulness
which
in
I'm
the sense
excited
that
about.
I try to pay attention to what's around me.
I'll just share that for now, and thanks for doing this project.
If someone is listening this out here in the future, just want to say, wow, that's so interesting.
So that's a quick window onto some of the audio material that people have contributed. I think as we listen to it, it probably pulls up a lot of emotions that many of us have felt since the pandemic started. And I want to shout out to Laurel Paymuller for doing the work of creating that lovely piece. So let's just talk a little bit about what this project is trying to do. Why did we create it? Certainly, one of the first and primary motives was to offer it up as a space for reflection and coping, a place where people could take some time to reflect on their own experiences and learn about others as well. There's also strong evidence that journaling in different forms can have a positive impact on mental health, so that's something that we had in mind. And then finally, and this is sort of the trickiest and also in some ways from a research standpoint most important piece, we really wanted to think about what it would mean to sort of pre-design an archive. We were thinking if historians are going to look back on this time, what will they want to have in hand in order to understand how it's affected us? And it became sort of tricky because on one hand, we're social scientists, so we're accustomed to protecting anonymity and confidentiality. And on the other hand, we wanted to get detail and specificity and really understand a lot about the people who were contributing in their life worlds and their experiences and their social positions. So we had to find a way to thread the needle in that regard. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've tried to do that. And obviously, we really wanted to make a particular effort to reach people who wouldn't necessarily see their stories on the record otherwise. So what is it trying to do? Well, it's certainly a space to reflect and to learn. It's become in some ways a virtual zone of encounter in ways that will become clear in a moment. As an anthropologist, I think about ethnography, and Kate and I have had lots of conversations about what it means for this to be a kind of grassroots ethnographic project where anyone, anywhere in the world can be taking field notes on the pandemic and what we're living through. We think of it very much as a form of archival activism in the ways that I've just described. And then finally, and this is sort of the newest piece, we're beginning to think more and more about how it can become a tool for decolonizing exhibition and museum spaces. And so that's sort of where I'd like you to think a little bit as you look at the images I'm going to share in a moment, because that's where I need the help and where I'm hoping that you can offer some insights. So how does it work? We invite people when they first sign up to complete a baseline survey, answering some questions about themselves, so we've got that demographic insight. And then we create 2 spaces each week and say, share your thoughts. The first one is the same every week. How's the pandemic affecting your life right now? And then the second prompt each week involves a choice. And I'll share some options in a moment. And people can write, they can record their voices, they can upload a photograph and talk about it. It can all be done on a smartphone. You don't need a computer. And it's entirely anonymous. And again, as I mentioned, it's bilingual, English and Spanish. So here are some of the kinds of questions that we might throw at people, because sometimes people need some kind of guardrail or some sort of invitation. Just a blank page can be very intimidating. So here are some questions we ask. Have any government policies had a direct impact on your life lately? If so, what's a policy that's affected you and how? Or some of the questions are more personal or time sensitive or anchored in the cycle of the year. Like, does this time of year feel different than it normally does? And depending whether people are receiving that question at the beginning of the school year or at Christmas time or on their birthday, they might respond in a very different kind of way. And that's another sort of tricky piece. We had to develop prompts that would be evergreen. So whenever they land on in your inbox, you feel like you can meaningfully engage with it. And some of the questions are really personal. When's the last time something made you cry, or talk about something that's bringing you joy or happiness? So in terms of pre-designing an archive, what does it actually mean? Well, it means 4 things. The first thing is that whatever people contribute is theirs. They can download it, they can keep it, they can share it with their family, they can share it with their friends. It belongs to them. And it also means that, that's the first thing, that we have this My Journal page where people can access their own material anytime. The second piece of the archive is that we do have a featured entries page, which is a curated site where we share material that people have given us permission to share. We won't share anything that hasn't been offered up to the archive without that permission. And this is what it looks like. So it's sort of the same page, and you can log in and then access your own material, or you can scroll through and read in different languages what people have contributed, see images, hear audio. And this, for many people, has been a really interesting way to learn what the pandemic has been like for people who are situated in very different spaces around the world, whose experiences have been very different. And then from a research standpoint, there are 2 other dimensions to the archive. First, everything that people contribute will be put into a qualitative data repository where researchers can access it and work with it for a period of 25 years. So once we stop inviting people to contribute, we're going to kind of close down the shop and take everything and put it into this secure space where people can access it with permission. And then after 25 years, all the material will become a fully publicly accessible resource in university libraries. So we're pre-designing an archive in a number of different ways. We've been getting the word out in all sorts of ways, through some wonderful media coverage, through social media. Educators, we have, about a third of the people contributing are students, which is very exciting. Also clinicians, and then some professional listservs and others have been ways that we've spread the word about the project. I mentioned we've gotten some nice media attention, which has been pretty exciting. I want to make sure I acknowledge that, again, this is a project involving many, many people with lots of intellectual resources and lots of time and lots of effort, and you can recognize some of them in this very room. We really owe a great debt to them. In particular, we owe a tremendous amount to this group of folks here on the bottom right, our core team. Heather Wirtz is our wonderful postdoc. Salman Mutfaki is our graduate assistant and data manager. And then Sophia, Jolie, and Anna are students, all undergraduate students. Some are at UConn, some are at Brown, and they make it a little bit run. So who are the people who decide to participate in a project like this? You're probably wondering. So far, we have almost 1,700 people, in fact, from more than 50 countries who've stumbled on the project, been introduced to the project. And as I mentioned, so far, we have over 20,000 individual journal entries, which is, for an anthropologist, that's like a mind-boggling number. It's a huge amount of material, and we're really learning how to work with it and how to use it. The vast majority are participating in English, but we do have some Spanish journalers. And I've shared a little bit of information about how people identify in terms of race and ethnicity. We've met some targets, failed to meet some targets. We could talk about that. But it's really been a lot of work to try and think about what it means to help prepare an archive that's going to represent people who might not otherwise be represented. So that's something that we can talk about more. Just to give you a quick visuals of where people are, this is a little bit outdated, but you can see we do have a concentration on the coasts in the US, but not to the exclusion of other parts of the United States. And as I mentioned, we have folks from all over the world, and again, this is a little outdated. It's not fully showing all of our representation, but we're really excited about the fact that we have voices from many, many different parts of the world, which is part of what makes it really quite interesting. Age-wise, this is interesting. Definitely participants skew young, unsurprising given the large number of students participating. But we do have a lot of folks who are older and more experienced as well. Our oldest journaler is 92, which is really nice. So we have people talking about their grandparents, people talking about their grandchildren. We have people talking about, the kinds of struggles and dilemmas that we encounter at all different stages of life and in all these different regions that I talked about. So what are people actually doing when they're journaling? And this is a question we can talk about for a very long time. And I'm just going to bracket this question here for now. What is journaling anyway? What comes to mind for you when you think of journaling? In what ways might that be gendered? In what ways might that be classed? In what ways might that seem something that really appeals to you? In what ways might that seem like something that, just doesn't at all speak to your interests or your goals? So we can talk about what journaling is later. But for now, let me just talk about what people are doing. This is something we're kind of playing around with as we think about what it is people are up to. You could sort of think of two axes. Are people journaling in order to meet needs now or in order to accomplish something in the near term, or are they thinking about the long term? So at the bottom, you can think about the now or the later. Are people thinking about personal goals, personal objectives, the therapeutic, recounting family histories? Or are they thinking about an audience that's not an intimate audience, that's a more distant audience? So to give this a little bit more flesh, we can think of this in terms of the inward as having a kind of personal or therapeutic function. We can think about inward looking toward the future as a kind of microhistorical project. If we think about journaling, outward with the longer term in mind, folks are thinking more about kind of contributing to an archive that will be sustainable, that will be read by others. And this is sort of closest to social media, right? Thinking about someone who's going to log in and see their entry posted and other people reading it tomorrow. So this is sort of a helpful way to think about the different kinds of things that people are aiming to accomplish in contributing. And I will say everything that I'm going to share falls into this category, and that I'm only sharing images that people have contributed publicly. So we can keep that in mind as we think about what I'm going to show you. So again, people contribute writing, audio recordings, and photographs. Sometimes photos of art that they've made, like this painting, watercolor, calligraphic piece. Sometimes they're, they contribute all sorts of stuff. So let's take a quick look, starting with things that people contribute really with this featured entries page in mind. There's someone who's been keeping who has their own project of daily haikus. They share many of them with the project. This is one of them. It's very brief. Sometimes they're really quite thought-provoking. Sometimes you can see that the person's really trying to meet their daily goal of creating a haiku and finding an image. I like this one in particular. When people are thinking about the archive, let's think about this documenting goal. So often people write about what it is they see themselves doing from this long-term historical lens. So this is a journalist who said, I hope that the history books will quote from PGP to show the uncensored voices of people from around the world, their rage, sadness, frustration, grief, optimism, humor, all of it, so that future generations understand how we experienced it uncensored and unfiltered. It's not so common for people to articulate their goals in quite this explicit a way, but this is really threading through a lot of what we receive. So a lot of what people want to preserve involves signs and symbols. Often in terms of thoughts on whether, what it means to be in solidarity with others from a kind of protection and prevention standpoint, or to press up against expectations and rules. So, we see lots of documentation of signs from the United States, from Germany on the left, from the Basque region of Spain on the right. Graffiti, right? People are messaging about these prevention goals and protection goals in all sorts of ways, not just in formal signs, but also in graffiti, in the signs that shopkeepers put up outside of their stores. This is a sign from a store in Massachusetts. Sometimes people write about a sign or a visual representation that pops up in their space that has meaning for them. So here's someone who works in a hospital, and they walk past this card that local school kids sent into the hospital, and seeing this image plays a role in their own management of the risks that they're facing as someone who's working in a hospital environment. We also see lots of visual representations of technologies of prevention. So these are handmade masks, much nicer than anything I've ever worn. But also more, formal technologies of prevention. So this is a pop-up COVID testing place in Berlin, complete with charming tented potted plants. And here's someone from the Philippines, or someone who's visiting the Philippines and had to go into quarantine. And this is the view from their hotel where they're in quarantine. They write about that experience. So I'm focusing here on the visual, but remember that these visual representations mostly are accompanied by text. This is one of my favorites. It's not a great image, but here's the technology of prevention. Early in the pandemic, I peeled the wrap type thingies off the coffee package. I brought some, as you know. And used duct tape to add them to a fabric mask. They weren't great as nose pictures, right? And this person says, I'm keeping these in case things go wrong again. What a crazy time. So creative technologies of prevention in the most mundane of ways. One of the things that we realized very early on, and we all know this, is that no one experienced just the pandemic, right? We've experienced the pandemic and wildfires and other forms of climate disaster and political turmoil and protests and movements for social justice. So much has happened in these recent months, and all of those different events, which of course are particular to different parts of the world, find expression in the journals that people create. So when the horrible wildfires were, you've seen so many of them, but about a year ago in the West, we heard people writing about and reflecting on what it's like to not be able to be outside or inside, and sharing images like this one. Certainly, politics and protest. Here's an image shared by someone with posters that they prepared for demonstration, saying, my skin is not a crime, get your knee off my neck, stop killing my people, save their names. This belongs in the archive too. Here's another image from someone, I'm pretty sure this is in West Hartford. There's a history professor in West Hartford who makes wild and crazy Halloween dioramas and displays outside of their home every year. And last year, this was part of that diorama. So this became part of what this person wanted to chronicle. And there were some other images from that as well, including a snippet from the graffiti on the demonstration itself, basically apologizing for not understanding structural racism and saying, sort of articulating their own personal plan for trying to learn and grow. This is from Scotland. Interestingly, a mural speaking up for George Floyd and against police brutality against the backdrop of COVID restrictions. Tent dwellers living on the streets of Berkeley, with some editorializing. Mercifully, the city has chosen to leave them alone and set up porta potties and hand washing stations. So we can see that people are, they're really bringing the fullness of their lives and their lived experiences into the journals that they're producing. We see images reflecting on a kind of new normal and asking what that new normal might look like. This is someone writing about a trip to San Diego and going to an outdoor symphony performance and thinking that maybe this is, where we're headed with a certain measure of joy, but also concern. So just a little bit about journaling, this microhistory. Yes, people write about baking bread, but sometimes in interesting ways. Like this person writes about how bread baking was recommended to women in Britain in World War II as a way to reduce stress during the Blitz. And now this person is baking with their child and children, with their grandchildren, and the children are punching out COVID as they knead the dough. Here's an image shared by someone who's reflecting on how histories of historical trauma continue to play a role in their family. So here are the masks I had to sneak away from my 65-year-old mom, who grew up with an inherited Depression-era mentality that will never go away. So we see an image of a mask, but think about the life of this mask and the history of this mask and the family dynamics surrounding, excuse me, these masks. Here's someone reflecting on how the pandemic has affected the child and a small moment of blossoming. We took my son to an aquarium. My son, who's quite cautious, did something that for him was very brave. He put his hand in the water and touched many of the rays and even fed them a few fish. We'd seen some regression, but this was a hopeful moment of growth and progress and growth. Also, children figure centrally in many journals. This image drawn by a 4-year-old says it all. She's learning about feelings, she's teaching me. So we see family dynamics and family challenges on expression journals as well. This is one of my favorites. This week was amazing. For the first time in 20 months, I was really able to spend time with my mother, who's in a nursing home. On Monday, it was her birthday. This is a picture of her friends wishing her a happy birthday and saying thanks for sharing the cake. And the person writes how they bought a cake for 4 and they had to cut it up into tiny pieces because everyone on the floor came for the birthday celebration. We see people dealing with life events that are transformed by COVID restrictions. I'll just sort of move a little quickly because I know time is of the essence here. Let's just say a few words about journaling as a personal record or a therapeutic tool. Some people have actually said thank you to us in different ways for creating the project. I'd hoped to write regularly, but on my own that habit died pretty quickly until I discovered this project. So that's pretty gratifying to hear. People talk about the kind of micro ways that they're taking care of themselves. This plant is named Arnold, and the diplodocus is named Kenny. This is one of my favorite images from our archive. And people write on occasion, likely you hear people writing about historical dimensions of what it is they're trying to do by journaling. Some also reflect very explicitly on the emotional and therapeutic dynamics of what they're trying to do. This journal's been a way for me to process, to relate, to empathize. I learned to stand up for myself and know that it's okay to be overwhelmed, to be broken, to lean into my family and friends. This journal has helped me find a way to connect with others without ever getting to meet them. For that, I'm truly grateful. This is really cool to read. How often do academics do something that gets this kind of reaction? It's really pretty exciting. But there's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of pain that people are writing about as well, and that can be difficult too, as the researcher, curator, person kind of behind the scenes. People write about darkness and despair. I love this green dot. This green dot has been the only way I've been able to look at my students, family members, my arts community, my activist friends, my church community for a whole year. I'm going to take a minute with this one, and then I'm going to kind of scoot through to the end. So this is it's not a clear image. but it's a powerful one, I think. The person writes, thick plastic separates me from the taxi driver. He's taking me home from the airport, where I've just returned from my mother's funeral. She died of COVID a month ago, and with everyone's vaccine schedules, this was the earliest we could have a service. A masked funeral, COVID, losing my mom, delivering a eulogy, the awkward reunions with long-lost relatives, all of it is impossible to describe. But something about that plastic was almost as disturbing, and it was hard not to cry. I think in some ways images like this are sort of doing some of the most important work in our power. This one, take a look at this. And let me tell you what it is. This person writes, back in March 2020, I created this fictitious magazine cover for a hypothetical publication and shared it with my friends as a joke. It seemed impossible in March 2020 that the pandemic could last until September of 2020. And then this person's posting it in September 2021, and they're still trying to fight that hideous monster. People are really creative and weird. So this is something that someone contributed. So what then can people teach us about the pandemic and about ourselves? Sometimes really small things. You know, what makes me happy getting to use a bathroom I didn't have to clean. I can relate to that. But let me say just a quick word about sort of the research that we've been doing, and then move into some of these new questions that I'm hoping you can help me think with. So some of the writing we've been doing so far include a paper on vaccine hesitancy, a paper on changing views of solidarity and human rights. And we're just about to wrap up a special issue looking at the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. And so we've got some papers looking at particular groups. So people who've become parents during the pandemic, healthcare providers, first-generation college students, and then a couple of papers on themes, on loneliness, on languishing, on resilience. So that's sort of the academic-y stuff. And then we're starting some new work looking at the impact of COVID-19 on first-generation students and parents, on Black women in the US, especially of immigrant backgrounds. That's a project that I'm working on with a new faculty member here, Julia Kalinowski, in Human Development and Family Studies. We are going to be doing a project looking at the impact of COVID-19 on sexual and reproductive health. And then some stuff on journaling itself. So one question we're asking that, I mentioned earlier that there's evidence that journaling can have positive mental health benefit, but we don't see research on Black women in specific. So Jalades and I are going to be working on that project, looking to see whether, for this community, journaling proves useful in reducing psychosocial stress. And then we have lots of other questions about, this question of what is journaling, what are people doing when they journal, what do they want to accomplish, what lands in a journal, what's excluded from a journal, different media for journaling. So, if we want to really think about this big question of what we can learn about knowledge, about truth, about ourselves, we have to kind of decide how we're going to engage with this material. What kind of space are we thinking about PJP as being? Are we thinking of it as a digital space, as an archival space, as a political space, as a contemplative space or therapeutic? What is it? How do we want to engage with it? Because these are all ways that we can engage with it. So, if we're thinking of it as archival, again, we've been talking about documenting and chronicling, remembering, retelling, preserving. If we want to engage it as a healing space, then that pushes us in another direction, looking at the ways people are venting or confessing or self-soothing. Often people in the course of a journal entry will talk themselves through a form of crisis or an experience of stress and get themselves to some place that they can inhabit for a while. And other possibilities as well. Certainly it's a creative space in all sorts of ways, but what would it mean if we were to think of our platform as it exists as an exhibition space? Or if we were to think about taking the kinds of images I've been sharing with you today and putting them into exhibition spaces. So just to land on some final questions, we can ask, what do the images contributed and journals' use of and engagement with those images suggest about the wildly variable impact of the pandemic, about journaling as practice, about contemporary visual culture, about technology and how it mediates experience, about knowledge and how we know what we know, or about truth, either now or in the future. So, you know, I can see this stuff. I don't know about Alexis or any of you. You know, Alexis likes to think with instigator objects. I think these are pretty cool instigator objects. They got me thinking about stuff, and we can see how images can speak to each other in different ways. And just to conclude, you know, there are a lot of pictures of pets, and there are a lot of pictures of flowers. And this is the one I wanted to share. This person writes, I was about to throw away a wilting bouquet of flowers when I noticed that there's beauty because of the dark edges, not in spite of them. It made me think of the pandemic and whether it's brought anything beautiful with it that I wouldn't have seen before. So just to kind of come back to our original goal and our original aim, it's insights like that we really want to make space for and put into the archive for all of us to have as resources and now and into the future. So I want to conclude by thanking first and foremost our journaling community of, again, almost 1,700 people around the world who've seen this as worth you know, either a little bit of their time or in some cases quite a lot of their time. I want to thank my co-founder Kate Mason, our core team, our postdoc Heather Wirtz, and the RAs that I introduced earlier. We have many supporters. I won't thank them all, but the webpage lists them all. But in particular, I want to thank the Humanities Institute, and especially Alexis and Michael for blessing this project and seeing fit to support it from the very beginning, and also Catholic people at the Human Rights Institute, among many others. So thank you all very much. And if you're interested, I can share some bad jokes. But I'll stop right there.
So I wanted to start my comments today just by saying thank you, Sarah, for your fascinating presentation. And thanks for the project that so gracefully addresses the real crazy world that we live in today, living through the pandemic. And I was really happy to be able to look through items that you sent to me from the project, which a highlight of my last week, really. And in one of the presentations that was available online, you quoted Richard D. Brown, who's a professor emeritus here at UConn, who said that we are not often consciously thrust into history. We are, now we are. And it is our opportunity to learn about ourselves and our society. And I can't think of a project that could better help us right now, at least in self-reflection. And so, and what is really kind of fascinating about this is how interdisciplinary and timeless it really is. By actively creating a robust qualitative archive, you make historians like myself who try to understand the lives of people in the past really jealous for the historians of the future that are going to be able to use this, and of course, especially the idea that the voices that are often left out of the archives or silenced in traditional archives are brought to the forefront in this project. And of course, I think of it as a historian, but I can imagine, of course, ethnographers, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, political scientists, philosophers, statisticians, art historians, and others, of course, are going to find this invaluable as an academic source. And today I want to leave time mostly for questions from others, because I'm sure there are tons of questions. And so I prepared two kind of questions that I'm gonna just throw out here. First one is about the sample. Specifically, your colleague Catherine Mason mentioned in one of the other discussions that you both had done that, and she described the sample as an anyone who wants to do it sample. and I think this makes absolute sense for this project. And then I was really, and we talked before, but I was really stunned on the map, looking at who has been journaling and who has not. And it appeared that very few people are journaling from the Intermountain West in the United States, which I come from and I'm studying. And actually, historians of the West have actually called the donut hole of Western history, because it's an area that's never really talked about. And in this case, I found this really surprising, because this isn't you saying or anybody in the project saying, let's not look at Nevada and Utah and Idaho, but it's them not being involved in it. And so I wonder if you had comments about, geography, politics, or cultural factors in that sense that lead to those who either engage or do not engage with this with this wonderful project. I guess my last question or comment / question is the notion that journaling can be therapeutic, which I actually really agree with. But I do remember also in 2020 receiving an email and an invitation to contribute to the journal, and I've mentioned this to you. And my first thought was like, wow, this is an amazing project. And my second thought was, I don't think I'm going to do it, because all I do is think about COVID. All I do is talk about COVID. COVID's everywhere. I don't know if I want more. And in a sense, it was like almost this overwhelming feeling like and I've changed my mind. I really think that the journaling would help, like if I sat down and thought through my process. But that was this sort of which brought the emotions of the overwhelming nature of COVID in general to me. And the question is not about me. In fact, I'm going to turn it to you by asking you, because you were also, of course, involved in the pandemic, right? Like everybody journaling, and you started this massive project that invited everybody to write down their feelings and to write down what they're going through, which I can't imagine the amount of physical and emotional labor that went onto your plate instantly at a time that you are also trying to process the exact same things that all of these people who are journaling are doing as well. So I guess my question is, first of all, are you okay? And the second one was, if you're interested, feel free to talk about any personal experiences that fit into the creation of this project, which you've done. But again, I could keep going on, but I know that there are many other questions, and I just want to make sure that we have time for them. And so feel free to address, either both or none of my comments is fine too. But and so I guess now we can either take questions or however you want to proceed.
Sure. Thank you so much for saying. I should move a little closer to the technology. Thank you so much for engaging with the project and for thinking with it and for asking these terrific questions. And I will say, there's a lot I could say on both points, and I'll be sort of brief, and I can go into more detail if there's interest. But on the first count, there's this thing that scientists call bias. We have that all in this project, but we've decided that it's a feature, not a bug. That's really, the short answer to your question. At the very beginning of the project, and I could go into a lot of detail about the technical details of trying to make it happen and trying to get it off the ground, we benefited very significantly from the involvement of a political scientist at Trinity College, Abby Fisher-Williamson, who was really there to help us navigate this question. And she was very involved at the beginning and ended up stepping away, in part because in her field, the kind of research that we were expecting to generate wouldn't really be legible to political scientists because of this issue of bias. And I completely understand and respect that decision, and it was fine. And for Kate and me, and I think Kate's here and might want to chime in if she has more to say. We essentially said, what, whatever people contribute will be interesting, and it will be meaningful, and it will be particular, and we'll have to analyze it and understand it in that light. And at the same time, if this crazy thing works, then we're giving people a tool. And if it's valuable for them, then honestly, who cares what data comes out of it? And that's a very, very strange thing for academics to say about a project that they're putting as you suggest, a lot of time and effort and sweat and tears into. But that really felt like the right way to go about it at the beginning. And that's really, I think, a segue to my response to your second question. This is a really big project, and neither Kate nor I was trained to do anything like this. So there's been some steep learning curves, and yes, it's been exhausting. And I think in our audience, there may be two small people, age 9 and 6, who happen to be my offspring on this point. One of whom, a 9-year-old, really wishes that there were a pandemic journaling project for people her age, and we weren't able to make that happen, which is one of my great sadnesses, just because of how IRBs work in terms of getting permission for people to put their thoughts and reflections on the record. So I think it has been exhausting. It has been draining. Kate and I think both have paid a price in some respects, but I think we both feel pretty comfortable offering up the verdict that it's been worth it. And if Darcy, if you're watching, I'm sorry that we don't have a way for 9-year-olds to bring. Yeah, my kids actually at 4 o'clock went to get their first vaccination. So this is a big day for me. I should probably do it. I think those are my quick answers to those great questions.
Wonderful. Maybe we can open up to questions here and then also online.
My question is, well, first of all, thanks for this fascinating and important project. And I have some questions, but you mentioned like political science have different views, so I'm probably one of them. And my question is kind of sort of like in line with Eric, but when you were talking about how you spread this website, right, the project, and you talk about Facebook, YouTube and all that. So it's let people know, the existence of your website so they can participate. So the question for me is, what about, and obviously when we see your map's kind of global, right? So people from outside of the United States also participate. The question is, do you see a systematic difference between people from democracy versus authoritarian? Because in authoritarian regimes, there's a censorship, right? So, Facebook, in China, for example, Facebook is banned, right? So, lots of channels that, that you're trying to, disseminate your website are actually not available to these people. So that actually reduces the chance for people to know this website in the first place, right? So that is number one question. So again, this is related to the representative of the sample, which, as you mentioned, you may not care about it, but I mean, which is fine. But given what we have, do we see a kind of systematic difference, right? So so that's number one. Number two is when we do our sample, normally we select our sample, right? So we use all sorts of technologies. We're trying to do non-random random sampling to get a representative sample. Whereas in your project, yours, people are self-selected into the sample, right? And so the question here again is, yeah, this is the best we can do, right? And it's still valuable. But then given that, and do we see some features of our sample? For example, I was wondering if because people are self-selected, so I was wondering if and people who are maybe more desperate, more helpless, in this process, are more willing to participate, right? So I don't know. So it's is there a, so this is like a bias, right? So it's do we see a certain type of people are more likely to participate than other types of people, right? And the other one is, I was still thinking about in authoritarian regime, in China where I'm from, the doctor who actually caused this, COVID in the social media died, and he was actually put in prison by the government. So when you see those participants from authoritarian countries, and do you see their content in your project? Do they more likely to reveal about their personal problems or experience rather than criticizing the government, right? And I don't know, right? So they may have some consequences by, like say something about the government. We don't know, right? So do we see some patterns in this?
Okay, so I'll tackle some of these in brief. In terms of, the big sort of frame for your questions about whether we can look at systematic differences between people in democracies versus authoritarian regimes, we don't have enough data to really speak to that, and I'll be, quite clear about that. The vast majority are in the United States. About 1,300 of the 1,699 as of today are in the US. So we don't have numbers that would allow us to really speak to those important questions. In terms of what we know about the people who are participating, I didn't go heavy on the data slides today because I expected our conversation to go in some other directions, but I can certainly pull them out. About 80% of the people who are participating are women. You saw the distribution in terms of age, which is pretty good, actually. And I shared some information in terms of race ethnicity. About 60-ish% identify of those who live in the US identify as white. I have to pull up the slide. About 10% is African American, about 15% Asian American, about 10% Latinx. In terms of income, we see a good amount of variation. In terms of educational level, definitely skews toward people with higher education. So some college or more, with a heavy, leaning toward people with a college degree or higher. Certainly some regions of less are better represented, New England, California, Illinois. And there are other, patterns that we can certainly see. I think, in terms of this issue of sample and what we can and can't say, there are some groups for which we have enough people that we can see some things, with some level of confidence that a generalization is worth testing further. I'm looking at this with right? But a lot of what we are doing as we dig deeper into the material, a lot of what we're doing is either really asking questions that are of a more humanistic nature, or we, and anthropologists are very comfortable doing this, we come to a place where we're developing hypotheses. So we say, we've got enough data here to have a good hypothesis. Somebody else can look into this further. And that's, for instance, for the special issue of social science and medicine, mental health that we're going to be finishing up pretty soon. That's a lot of what we're doing. These are short papers that are saying, okay, we've got 60 people who fit this set of criteria. We've got 35 people who fit those criteria. Here's some stuff we're seeing. This is worth looking into further. And that in itself has value, even for those who lean more toward the positives, right?
Maybe one from
online. Okay. So Martha Cutter was asking a similar question about socioeconomic diversity in that spectrum. I'll just focus on her last question here on that. She had other questions, but her first last question, she wants to know if the differences, the people from different socioeconomic statuses, are their contributions differing, I'm assuming qualitatively, from individuals in different socioeconomic levels? And then just gonna sneak in a similar question from Prakash Pishwan. He asks also about diversity, but he wants to know if the journaling project attracted any COVID deniers, anti-vaxxers, or anyone who believes in conspiracy theories, or if anybody was mentioning anything about China virus, Asian virus, any anti-Asian sentiments, and if that was present in any of the things that you've seen so far.
Yeah, great questions. I'll start actually with Prakash's question, and if you're able to save the questions, I'm
gonna copy and paste. There's a lot here stuff.
Terrific, thank you. So here's another bias. Pretty much everybody who's participating thinks that COVID exists, that it's scary, that it's dangerous, and that we should do things to protect ourselves. Now, that said, there's a lot of variation. And Kate and I gave a talk at Brown a couple weeks ago, and she put together a brilliant slide that I should have shared today. That was part of the analysis we're doing for this paper on vaccine hesitancy, in which she pulled out a paragraph in which someone was a Latino woman from North or South Carolina, talking through all the reasons why she didn't want to get vaccinated, and then felt like she should get vaccinated, but was hesitant, and her friends were hesitant, but in the end she got vaccinated because she had to for work. And Kate actually went through and like rainbow color coded and got through the whole rainbow because this person had so many different reasons for and against vaccination. And that's with a Democrat from a southern state. So we don't have too many people who flat out deny that COVID exists. But you know, there's texture, there's complexity. People are puzzling through a lot of things. And that's another really wonderful issue that we can look at in journals. That said, we do hear people talking a lot about people around them who might be deniers, who might, you know, use language to talk about the pandemic that they wouldn't themselves feel comfortable using. So it's in there, just not necessarily in the first person. In terms of different socioeconomic levels, we have very wealthy people. There's one woman who went to Bermuda so that they wouldn't have to stay in the continental US and be at risk of exposure. Of course, then there were cases in Bermuda. But, you know, so there are people who are able to kind of buffer themselves from risk in many ways as a result of having access to privilege and resources. And there are many people who are really struggling to put food on the table. There are people talking about using food banks. There are people talking about not being able to make ends meet. You know, we ask specific questions about the financial impact of the pandemic, and a lot of people have a lot to say. So we really do see, you know, in response to Martha's question, we really do see a lot of variation. And that's been one of the really, I think one of the successes of the project. You know, and there are other points where we would have loved to have more people who were more skeptical, who were more resistant to vaccination, because they're there and their perspectives should be recorded, but they're just less recorded.
So thank you for the project and thank you for your talk. I have been really interested in thinking about time in the pandemic, the sort of temporal scale and framework. And as you know, I spend a lot of my time thinking and talking to healthcare workers who went from, you know, frontline heroes at one point to some who were skeptical about getting the vaccine initially, and then articulated the idea that they were now supposed threats. And then over time, now as the pandemic ebbed and flowed, people who were very scared in the beginning, towards the end, right now where we are, we're sort of going to other places to work because there was a demand, right? So I'm sort of interested in sort of thinking through the whole scale of the pandemic, but thinking about different moments. And I wondered if that showed up in the journals. How have the entries sort of changed over time, the tone, the tenor, and were there points, various inflection points where, you know, certain kinds of entries became more prominent. So I guess I'm just interested in the fact that because the pandemic has gone on so much longer than any of us anticipated, right? So how has that, or has that played out in the entries that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. If you gave us some time, gave us some time, we could answer your question specifically with regard to healthcare workers, but I'd have to sort of roll my sleeves and get into that. Yeah. But in terms of the bigger picture of time, you know, there's sort of, we can think of this in terms of the narrative, we can think of this visually, we can think of this in terms of the connections between the two. And I'll give you the short, quick, easy answer in terms of visual. We see the seasons passing. You know, we've got summer images, we've got foliage, and then we've got snowmen with masks on. And so we go through the seasons a couple of times and the holidays a couple of times. So we certainly see time passing in that regard. There's also political time. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about the different kinds of time and how they're unfolding over these past couple of years. We have pandemic time, we have political time, we have life cycle time, we have developmental time with children. You know, there are all sorts of ways we could think about time and its progression and its cyclicality, and they all find expression in the journals in different ways. And so we'd have to sort of pick one. And I've talked about the seasons. You know, another theme that we see as people think about, you know, I haven't said too much about it today, but missing opportunities to connect, If we think back to the opening quotation and the ways in which the pandemic has really hit us in terms of our connectedness, our ability to connect as people, I think anyone in this room can think about times when something important was happening and you really needed to be with someone you care about and you weren't, and you couldn't be, right? So there's loss and there's mourning, and that those moments are irreplaceable, and that's really hard. And yet at the same time, and I don't need to be sort of a naive optimist, we see such evidence of creativity and such evidence of people leveraging technology in ways that helped, provide something of a balm for those wounds. Whether it's, I zoomed through this quickly, but the woman who talked about going to her mother's grave with her sister and figuring out the Zoom bandwidth was so that they could Zoom her father's funeral because they couldn't be together for the funeral. So there's so much we could say about time, and that's, I think, the short answer that we could definitely say.
I know Elizabeth, you've had your hand raised.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I had a question. I was really struck by a number of times when the images would come up and say, I really love this one, but it's not a great picture. And I was struck by the ways in which that suggests that like the aesthetic of the images that people are sharing are distinct from the kinds of images people share on, say, like social media, right? Like no one would ever share a blurry image on Instagram, right? Because like that's not what you're doing on Instagram. And I think like that really suggests like the aesthetic of the images themselves, and maybe even like what we might say the quality of the images, maybe suggests that people are doing something really different in here than they are on social media. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I will, the first part of my response is that when I'm worrying about the quality, I'm thinking about two things right now. I'm thinking about my curator friend over here, and she's gonna say, and I'm thinking about, regardless of her, because we're doing an exhibition which may or may not play a leading role in, I'm thinking about whether I can blow them up big enough to hang them in a wall, right? So, the image that I showed of the twisty ties, right? I don't know if that's a big enough image to make it work, right? So like, could we have that blurry image and then a stack of these things, the instigator objects, so kind of get people thinking. So we're cataloging the images and the audio files right now. It's a big project that research assistants are working on, and we're making sure to note that file size because that will matter in terms of what we can do with it. But that's the technical answer to the question. The substantive answer to the question really moves us in a very different direction, which is the question of how is this different from social media? Like, what are people doing here that's different from their Facebook page or their Instagram feed? And I would posit that it's really different. I think, yes, as I mentioned earlier, there are people, and some of them become a little persistent. There are people who really want to see a post on that curated page, and they might post the same photograph again and then again the following week, and like they really want to see it up there, and maybe we choose it and maybe we don't. And there are all sorts of considerations that go into curating that page. But for the most part, I think that when people are posting on social media, they have a very different sense of audience. They have a very different sense of temporality, and that which they want to express has a kind of existing audience that they can imagine. They know who's out there. They might have particular people that they want to, from whom they want to elicit a particular kind of reaction. When people are posting, or contributing to their journal, to think of it as posting is sort of odd and doesn't quite sit well. When people are contributing to their journals, they're thinking about audience. I wouldn't, dare to suggest that people aren't thinking about audience, but it's a very different kind of audience. It's an anonymous audience. Maybe they're thinking about researchers. Maybe they're thinking about their children and how they want this to be, this downloaded compendium of stuff to be something that their grandchildren can look at if they have a computer that will read the files in 50 years, right? We're gambling on that to a certain extent. So I think it's quite different from social media in that regard. There is one thing that I was thinking about a lot in putting together these images today, which is like, I don't want to just show pretty images. I had pictures of more dirty masks and things like that, but there's a lot I wanted to do, so I didn't show too many of those. But there are some very beautiful images that people are they're sharing. But a lot of them are not. They're messy, they're mundane, they're overwhelming, but they're putting them there for a reason. And that reason itself is interesting and substantive. And to understand what they're doing in journaling requires that we ask, okay, why is this person posting this completely overwhelming picture of the floor of their living room where they're redoing their go bags, right? With all the survival materials that they want to have in case things should escalate. Like they're putting that picture there for a reason, and we should think with that reason. We should reflect on that reason. No judgment. You should have your go bags if you need to go bags. But if you're going to take a picture of it, you're putting it in that archive for a reason. So yeah, we can think about image selection and composition and quality and technical characteristics in all sorts of different ways.
Do you want to? Maybe one, Fiona.
Are you guys collecting data on users, on whether the PJP contributors are then engaging the curated page in particular? And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about like what's guiding the publicly curated content page.
Sure. So we're not able to see who's looking at the curated page. They're actually different. So there's our website where kind of things run for the most part. Then there's the journaling platform, which is through Qualtrics. We basically hacked Qualtrics and turned it into a journaling platform. And then the place where people can access their own journals and see curated entries is a separate webpage that we hired a very talented and well-compensated web designer to create. And there's no data talking between these different. I can't answer that particular question. In terms of the curation, generally, it's until very recently, it was basically mostly me, with some help from some of our RAs. And I would try to get something visual, something audio, something in Spanish in addition to the English, and try to cover some of the variation that we've been talking about in terms of geography, in terms of socioeconomic status and other aspects of social position, in terms of, not too much that's heavy and sobering and depressing, some uplifting stuff. So really trying to create a space that people would want to come to and visit, and that would allow them to learn things that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. So that's very crude, but those are sort of the rules of thumb.
All right. Well, this was a wonderful event. I want to just add before we thank Sarah and Eric how happy I am to have you as a future Truth Fellow this year. I hope that you've all seen that this project really speaks to the question of the uncomfortable and difficult truths we're all struggling with because of the pandemic. And it's really, I'm proud to be helping you navigate this difficult process. So thank you.